In my book Introducing the Ancient Greeks, I try to explain in a single slim volume the distinctive features of pagan ancient Greek culture for the entire 2,000 years it flourished, from about 1600 BCE to 400 CE. The phenomenon has been called the Greek miracle, as well as the glory or wonder that was Greece. Many books have been entitled things like the Greek genius, the Greek triumph, the Greek enlightenment, the Greek experiment, the Greek idea, and even the Greek ideal. But over the last 2 decades, the notion that the Greeks were exceptional has been challenged. It's now been stressed that the Greeks were, after all, just one of many ethnic and linguistic groups in the ancient Mediterranean world. Long before the Greeks appeared in the historical record, several complex civilizations had already arisen. The Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Hattians, the Hittites. And in the late 19th and 20th centuries, our understanding of the other cultures of the ancient Near East advanced rapidly. We know far more now about the minds of the Greeks' predecessors and neighbours, far more than we did before the landmark discovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh on clay tablets in the Tigris Valley in 1853. There's been a constant stream of newly published writings in the languages of the successive peoples who dominated the fertile plains of Mesopotamia: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. The words of Hittites on the tablets found at Hatissa in central Turkey and the phrases inscribed on clay tablets at Ugarit in northern Syria have been deciphered. New texts, as well as fresh interpretations of writings by the ancient Egyptians, continue to appear, requiring, for example, a complete reassessment of the importance of the Nubians to North African history. Now, many of these exciting advances have revealed just how much the Greeks shared with their predecessors and neighbours. Painstaking comparative studies have been published which reveal the so-called Greek miracle to have been just one constituent of a continuous process of intercultural exchange. It's become the new orthodoxy that the Greeks were very similar to their ancient Near Eastern neighbours in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, Persia and Asia Minor. Some scholars have even gone so far as to ask whether the Greeks came up with anything new at all, or whether they merely acted as a conduit through which the combined wisdom of all the ancient civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean was disseminated across the territories conquered by Alexander the Great, before then arriving at Rome and posterity. Others have seen sinister racist motives at work and accused classicists of creating, in their own image, the oldest dead white European males, Odwems. Some have even claimed that classicists have systematically distorted and concealed the evidence, and some have, showing how much the ancient Greeks owed to Semitic and African peoples rather than to Indo-European traditions. So the question has therefore become painfully politicised. Critics of colonialism and racism tend to play down the specialness of the ancient Greeks. Those who still maintain that there was something identifiably distinctive and even possibly superior about the Greeks, on the other hand, are usually conservatives who have a vested interest in approving the superiority of so-called Western ideals and in making evaluative judgments of culture. My problem is that I fit into neither camp. I'm certainly opposed to colonialism and racism. I've investigated reactionary abuses of the classical tradition, but my constant engagement with the ancient Greeks and their culture has actually made me more rather than less convinced that they evinced a cluster of brilliant qualities which are difficult to identify in combination and such concentration elsewhere in Mediterranean or ancient Near Eastern antiquity. No other linguistic group produced anything quite equivalent to Athenian democracy, comic theatre, or Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. I don't deny, of course, that the Greeks acted as a conduit for other ancient peoples' achievements. But to function successfully as a conduit, channel, or intermediary is in itself to perform an exceptional role. It requires a range of talents and resources. Taking over someone else's technical knowledge requires an opportunistic ability to identify a serendipitous find or encounter, excellent communication skills, and the imagination to see how a technique, story, or object could be adapted to a different linguistic and cultural milieu. And in this sense, the Romans fruitfully took over substantial achievements of their civilization from the Greeks, as did the Renaissance humanists. Of course, the Greeks were not by nature or in potential superior to any other humans, either physically or intellectually. In fact, they themselves frequently commented on how difficult it was to distinguish Greek and non-Greek, let alone free person from slave person, if all the trappings of culture, clothing and adornment were removed. But that does not mean that they were not the right people in the right place at the right time to take up the human baton of intellectual progress for several hundred years. And the 10 characteristics of the ancient Greeks, which most of them shared most of the time, and which I believe made them the baton bearers for those crucial centuries, are these. The Greeks were seagoing, suspicious of authority, individualistic and inquiring. They were also open to new ideas, witty and competitive. They admired excellence in talented people, as well as being wildly articulate and addicted to pleasure. And today I'm going to focus on the first characteristic, which I believe explains most of the others: their obsession with the sea. In 490 BCE, the important Greek strait of Eretria was burned to the ground by the invading Persians and its population taken captive, never to return. The Persian king made the Greek prisoners found a colony far inland between Babylon and Susa. And a poem attributed to Plato imagines their collective tombstone inscription in their inland Asiatic exile. We left the deep roar of the Aegean Sea. We lie here in the central plain of Ecbatana. We salute you, Eretria, once our famed fatherland. We salute you, Athens, neighbour of Eretria. We salute you, beloved sea. Their fatherland had been a harbour town. But ancient Greeks hardly ever settled in their distinctive city-states more than 25 miles, that's a day's walk, from the sea. Early and classical Greeks lived in hundreds of small communities which were autonomous and independent-minded, practising a way of life which was the inevitable response to their physical environment. Most of the farmable land in the mainland Greek peninsula and the islands of the Aegean is isolated by mountains or sea or both. There are only 25,000 square miles in Greece today, which means it's smaller than all but 10 of the states in the USA: West Virginia, Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Hawaii, Connecticut, Delaware and Rhode Island. It's much smaller than Portugal or Scotland. But Greece contains no fewer than 26 areas where the land rises higher than 3,000 feet, making travel by land endlessly challenging. Moreover, the number of headlands, inlets and islands makes the proportion of coastline to land area higher than any other country in the whole world. The Greeks did feel trapped when they were far inland. They travelled hundreds of miles to find places to build cities which had easy access to the sea. Their communities therefore came to line many of the shores of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and their separate islands. They were one of the most littoral, with two T's, peoples the planet has ever seen. Their preferred mode of transport was by ship, although they also preferred not to sail too far from the land. As Plato put it, they chose to live like frogs or ants around the pond. They were cultural amphibians. And the notion of the creature that is as at home on land or sea was imaginatively displaced in myth onto the sea's actual inhabitants, who were usually imagined by the Greeks as half human and half beast. Glaucus, once a fisherman, ate a special herb and became the original merman, half man, half fish, with green-blue skin. In June 1968, a beautiful image of a diver was discovered in a tomb of the early 5th century BCE excavated at Posidonia or Paestum in part of southern Italy which the Greeks had colonised. These Greeks had moved to having already built one colony further south in Italy, the city of Sybaris, famed for its luxury. But the diver was painted on the underside of the lid of a rectangular tomb, and on its walls were painted equally beautiful scenes of men enjoying themselves on couches at a symposium. The man buried in the tomb, surrounded by his drinking companions, would be able to look forever at a picture of a diver suspended between a stone-built diving board and the inviting turquoise water into which his outstretched hands are about to plunge. And some have said that the diver has an erotic message. For others, the scene of diving is a metaphor for dying, for the leap between the known and the unknown worlds, between the elements, perhaps with occult resonances connected with Orphism or Pythagoreanism. But the painter has taken the trouble to add just a slight growth of hair to his chin in specially diluted paint. The diver is touchingly young. Did he look at all like the deceased? Could he simply have been famous for his skill at diving? The Greeks' sense that they were masters of the sea is really expressed in their attitude to swimming. The Athenians believed it was the duty of every father personally to teach his sons how to read and how to swim. The proverb characterising the most uneducated or boorish type of man said he could neither read nor swim. The Assyrians and Hebrews actually both portrayed their enemies drowning. But the Greeks' conviction that they were the best swimmers in the world was a core constituent of their collective psyche and identity. They felt this was proved during the Persian Wars, when many of the enemy had drowned. The Greeks also celebrated the notable exploits of two expert Greek divers, a man called Scyllus and his daughter Hydne, and they'd sabotaged the enemy fleet from underwater. The Greeks had developed the science of diving to a sufficiently high level to enable practitioners to stay below water for considerable lengths of time with the aid of inverted air containers lowered to them by force. And the heroes of Greek myth, whom the young were trained to admire, were outstanding divers and swimmers. Theseus, the son of Poseidon, and mythical founder of the Athenian democracy, proved his mettle on the voyage to Crete before he even met the Minotaur. He accepted a challenge to dive down to the depths and retrieve Minos' ring from the palace of his father. But even Theseus' feat was outdone by Odysseus' distance swim after his raft broke up. He used raw muscle power to resist the line of breakers crashing on the shore of Scheria and keep away from the land until he could find a landing place free of rocks and turbulent winds. Even the earliest Greeks we can get close to, the Mycenaeans, loved proper names containing elements connected with the sea or with sailing. One of the early Greeks named in Linear B was Fair Voyage, Euplus. Others were called Fair Ship, Eunaeos, Ocean Goer, Pontius, famous for ships, Nausicles, and Swift Ship, Okunaos. In other respects too, Linear B confirms the Homeric picture of Greeks to whom sailing and rowing was second nature. Amongst the titles designating occupations, both coastguards and craftsmen who specialised in shipbuilding received separate labels. At Knossos, rowers are included in a list of officials supplying or receiving cattle. At Pylos, it's possible that some rowers were conscripted, perhaps the sons of slave women. There's even a specific mention in one Pylos tablet of a naval expedition, since 30 men's names, perhaps the personnel to man the oars of a single ship, are designated oarsmen to go to Pleuron. And this is likely to be the city called Pleuron on the north shore of the Gulf of Corinth, which is named in the Iliad. A likely reason for sailing expeditions beside trade was always the acquisition of slave labour. Some of the tablets at Pylos indicate the labour force was recruited by raids in which captive women and children were brought home and taught trades. And the places where the women are said to have come from are across the sea in the Eastern Islands and Asia Minor. The women come from Lemnos, Cnidos, Miletus, and perhaps Chios. And Poseidon, the sea god, was very important to the Mycenaeans. The Poseidon to whom Nestor makes a vast sacrifice in the Odyssey was worshipped in reality at Pylos and Knossos. So the amphibious nature of the Mycenaeans is also very apparent in the frescoes from Akrotiri in Thera Santorini. By the early 4th century, when Plato explains the physical nature of their environment, the Greek sense of their geospatial relationship to the world was dramatically different from that implied by the Aegean-focused map of the Mycenaean world, or that drawn by the catalogue of ships in the Iliad. In Plato's Phaedo, Socrates says, "The earth is very large, and we who dwell between the pillars of Hercules and the river Phasis," that's the Rione in modern Georgia, "we do so only in a small part of it around the sea, like frogs or ants around the pond." These Greeks had competed commercially with the Syrians and Phoenicians at this crucial crossroads between the worlds of the Aegean, the Levant, and the many peoples of the Asiatic interior. But other Greeks soon travelled just as indomitably south, west and north to found cities in what are now Libya, France, Crimea, cheek by jowl with Africans, Gauls, Iberians, Thracians and Scythians. The Milesians penetrated the Black Sea even to the remote estuary of the River Don to trade with tribes who were in turn in contact with southeastern Asia. And wherever these Greeks settled, they stayed near to the sea, their preferred thoroughfare and their escape route. When they did occasionally settle inland, it was always with a firm connection to an established coastal city, and the importance to the Greek colonists of the dolphin is what I want to focus on next. Dolphins and symposia are closely connected, and the importance of the symposium in a newly founded colony is apparent from the large number of cups and jugs for wine which have been found by archaeologists who excavate far-flung Greek settlements. In Paestum, Posidonia, where the tomb of the diver portrays an elegant symposium in full swing, potters began there making distinctive local symposium pottery instead of importing it. And the presiding god of the symposium, Dionysus, is portrayed on many, along with his retinues of revelling satyrs and maenads. In myth, Dionysus is the god of Epiphany who arrives on land from the sea. Sometimes he arrives in a ship accompanied by dolphins, as on this gorgeous black figure cut proudly signed by the incomparable potter Exekias, where Dionysus' white-sailed ship, surrounded by glossy black dolphins, glides across the smooth terracotta surface. In some sources, Dionysus rides on a dolphin himself. In the Homeric hymn to Dionysus, he's captured by Tyrrhenian or Etruscan pirates and only escapes by changing them into dolphins. And the strange image of men dolphins, or men in the process of morphing into dolphins, which also appears in vase painting, suggests that when Greeks were thinking about Dionysus in a maritime context, they imagined themselves as dolphins of his retinue rather than land-based satyrs. After all, they created a visual link between dolphin and satyr by nicknaming and painting them both as semos, which means snub-nosed. And the very experience of the symposium itself suggested the analogy of the sea voyage. And the link here had something to do with the music of the aulos, often played two at a time by the same piper. And this is a reeded instrument, more like our modern oboe than the flute. And the animal which universally symbolised the experience of colonisers was the dolphin. At Taras, the foundation hero Phalanthos, flowery penis, was saved from drowning by a dolphin, and he's depicted as such on the coins of the town. And so is the hero Taras, a son of Poseidon. And dolphin riders appear on the coins of numerous cities, both on the mainland of Greece and in the islands and colonies. The most famous was Arion, a poet who played the kithara, that's Apollo's instrument, but who also invented the dithyramb, the hymn to Dionysus, in a story featuring all the core elements of the Age of the Tyrants, lyric poetry and colonisation. In this story, Herodotus relates that Arion was a musician from the island of Lemnos. He worked at the court of the Corinthian tyrant Periander. Arion sailed to Taras in Sicily to take part in a musical contest. Now, so far, nothing in this narrative is implausible. After winning, he was just thrown overboard by pirates. But a dolphin, in acknowledgement of the beauty of Arion's song, carried him to shore at Tainarum in the Peloponnese, where there was a sanctuary of Poseidon. And the Greeks liked the idea of dolphin riding so much that the female Nereids got to do it in Greek art too. Side saddle. The psychological connection between poetry and the dolphin is stressed by the lyric poet Pindar. He praises the work of another poet, a Sicilian, because it has made him feel like a dolphin of the sea, which the lovely melody of pipes has excited in the expanse of a waveless sea. Ancient Greek sailors employed musicians to help them keep time as they rowed, and preferred for this purpose the penetrating, plangent music of the aulos. And the ancient Greek metaphor of the symposium as a voyage in a sea-going ship was produced by the cultural connection between the symposium and colonisation. How better to cement the esprit de corps of a new community who together braved the perils of the open sea than by a constructive drinking session? And the frenzy of a storm at sea, as experienced by a crew, is used as a metaphor for the collective psychological experience of fellow symposiasts. Euripides' bibulous Heracles in Alcestis, and that's a favourite hero of colonisation myth, he actually sees a connection between rhythmically raising and lowering a wine cup to drink and the steady rhythm of rowing. The metaphor became near reality once. A house in the Sicilian city of Akragas was actually renamed the Trireme after a carousal. The young symposiasts became so inebriated, they imagined they were being battered by a storm while out at sea. And the narrative that reports it says, they completely lost their senses finally and tossed all the furniture and bedding out of the house as though upon the waters, convinced that the pilot directed them to lighten the ship because of the great raging storm. Well, a huge crowd gathered and began to carry off the jetsam, but even then the youngsters did not cease from their mad actions. When the drunkards were called to account, they explained that they had been temporarily deluded, and they were pardoned, but on condition that they never again drank excessively. The implication is that they needed some older men at the symposium to train them in responsible drinking. In the temporary madness of the symposium, the Greek sailor colonists of the lyric age drank in the presence of the sea-going wine god with his leaping entourage of music-loving dolphins until they became half seas over and their collective ship came in. The dolphin was also associated with two other senior Olympian gods who were very important during Greek migrations. Poseidon, frequently portrayed in art with a dolphin, and he was the grandfather of Theseus, and dolphins helped Theseus come back from the seabed on that adventure on his way to Crete. Poseidon was also tied to a dolphin story involving Dionysus on the Greek mainland at Megara and Corinth, two cities heavily involved in colonisation. A Greek princess named Ino hurled herself and her son off the Malurian cliff. Dionysus transformed Ino into an important sea goddess named Leucothea, while a dolphin appeared to transport the body of her son to the isthmus, where an altar to him was built by a sacred pine tree. At nearby Corinth, Leucothea and her son were worshipped in conjunction with Poseidon. And here we catch, I think, a rare glimpse of a Phoenician element in this seaside tale of a hero and a dolphin, and that's not unlikely given the history of trading between Phoenicians and Corinth. Greeks were terrified of hideous monsters lurking in the ocean to devour hapless seamen. They felt an affinity with dolphins themselves, imagined them to be the victims of the same leviathans. In the Odyssey, the monstrous six-headed, 12-footed Scylla plucks men from ships, but it's dolphins on which she normally preys. Dolphins, like humans, are highly intelligent mammals with strong social and kinship ties. They evince what appears to human eyes to be joy when they cavort in the water, and they don't predate on humans. And these are some of the reasons why many seagoing human societies have formed psychological and ritual bonds with the dolphin, but none as intense as the Greeks. They painted dolphins on their walls, emblazoned dolphins on their shields, carved them on their gemstones. No fewer than 40 Greek cities portrayed a dolphin on their coins. Dolphins appear abundantly in ancient Mediterranean art and literature, from the frescoes of Thera and Knossos to the Byzantine Christian story that the martyred corpse of St. Lucian of Antioch was recovered for his disciples by a dolphin. The Greeks believed that the feeling was reciprocal. A fable by Aesop tells how a dolphin gave a monkey a lift on his back, mistaking him for a human. But by testing his intelligence questions, he questioned the monkey, discovered he was too ignorant to be human, and therefore abandoned him to be drowned. The perceived connection of the dolphin with colonisation transcended tribal loyalties. The cult of Apollo as Delphinios, or Apollo of the dolphin, was originally Ionian, and Ionian men were sometimes given the personal name, Delphinios. But the cult and the name were adopted by Dorians as well, for example at Sparta and on Aegina. For all the Greeks, Apollo was implicated in the project of expansion overseas as god of the oracle at Delphi on the Greek mainland, at the navel or epicentre of the world, encircling the pond. The aural connection the Greeks heard between the name Delphi and the word for dolphin, Delphis, made the link between the oracle and maritime expeditions enticing. And the myth that the Greeks used to explain this title interlaced the themes of seafaring, colonisation, poetry and prophecy at Apollo's Delphic seat. An old hymn to Apollo explains that when the god was looking for priests to serve in his sanctuary, he spotted a Cretan ship from Knossos sailing towards Pylos to trade. Apollo turned himself into a dolphin, leapt into the Cretan's ship and prevented them from throwing him overboard. A swift wind provided by Apollo propelled them all the way around the Peloponnese to the coast at Chrysa near Delphi. And after lighting the fire in his shrine and turning back into anthropomorphic form, he told the Cretans they were destined to serve his oracle. He ordered them to build an altar on the beach, light a fire, make an offering and pray to him as Apollo of the dolphin, because it was in the form of a dolphin that he'd led them there. They were to process to this oracle singing the paean, the special hymn for Apollo. And the Cretan leader raised the issue of earning a livelihood. Like any sensible colonist, he'd assessed the terrain and seen that it would be hospitable neither to vines nor to livestock. But Apollo promised their needs would be met, and the Cretan immigrants brought over the sea by Apollo of the dolphin became forefathers of the priests of Pythian Apollo of the dolphin. And he was worshipped in temples overlooking harbours at the very extremities of the Greek colonial world. In the far west at Massalia, Marseille, where the Ionian leader Phocea in Asia Minor had married the local Gaulish princess, twin temples of Apollo Delphinios and his sister Artemis stood on the rocky headlands. At Ephesus, another glamorous Ionian town on the Asiatic seaboard, a guild of sacred singers called Molpoi were dedicated to Apollo Delphinios. So the dolphin's connection with music and poetry actually transcended the difference between the gods Dionysus, in charge of the dithyramb, the pipes and sympathetic poetry, and Apollo, associated with epic poetry, the Cythera and the Muses. There was a connection between the rites of initiation into manhood and the singing of paeans or hymns to Apollo in his guise as Apollo Delphinios. His worship may also have involved young men being sent on return voyages to and from distant locations in order to mark their integration into the adult community. When the Milesians founded colonies across the sea, they intuitively felt that Apollo of the dolphin had helped them sail there, and they always founded new shrines in his honour. Apollo Delphinios was worshipped in all the Milesians' Black Sea colonies at Olbia, Sinope, Gorgippia. At Olbia in Ukraine, Apollo Delphinios even had specially dedicated sacred singers, Molpoi as in the mother city of Miletus. And one of the peculiarities of Olbia was its dolphin-shaped coins, actually formed like dolphins leaping high in the air with curving spines. The Greeks used metaphors to do with the sea, ships and sailing for almost every sphere of activity. In the Iliad, when the Greek army goes into battle, it looks like a wave rearing close-ranked out of the sea under the blast of the west wind. The sight of Odysseus to his lonely wife is like the first glimpse of land to a shipwrecked mariner. But the seashore was also a place where Greek heroes liked to think, and that perhaps made it inevitable that maritime imagery would become common in the descriptions of thought processes. Nestor, the wise old counsellor in the Iliad, faced with a strategic problem on the battlefield, pondered the alternatives deeply, like the vast sea when it darkens with a silent surge before swift shrill winds arise, but it doesn't roll forward at all, nor to either side, until Zeus brings the gale to a critical point. And the king in a tragedy by Aeschylus, faced with an international crisis, says he needs to engage in profound deliberation, like a diver descending into the depth. To read a treatise on philosophy was to go on a voyage. When Diogenes the cynic came to the end of a long and unintelligible book, he said with sardonic relief, "I can see land." In Plato's Republic, Socrates is trying to persuade Glaucon of his controversial views on women and children, and to express the difficulty of the philosophical challenge, he chooses an analogy from swimming. Whether someone falls into a small swimming pool or into the middle of the largest sea, he must swim all the same. Dealing with a philosophical impasse requires argumentation regardless of the triviality or weightiness of the topic. Socrates, as portrayed in the writings of Plato, uses a very large number of maritime images. Although he didn't invent the metaphor, Plato gives Socrates the most famous instance of the analogy of the ship of state. If there isn't to be a mutiny, a ship requires an individual captain to steer it, and our word govern is etymologically connected with the same root as the Greek word for steer a ship, kubenan. But he must also be endowed with a superior competence in several branches of knowledge. Other kinds of ruler were seen as ship's captains. When the Greeks imagined Zeus ruling the universe, they sometimes conceived him as the helmsman of Olympus, just as he has an epithet, sitting high on its benches, supervising the oarsmen in Homer. Nor was it just political theory that attracted naval analogies, so did cosmology and eschatology. The Greeks imagined the entire universe as being constructed like an enormous trireme. At the climax of the Republic, Socrates tells the story of who'd visited the land where the dead souls go before miraculously returning to life. Description of the constitution of the universe was that it was held together by an absolutely straight column of light, which extends right through the whole of heaven and earth, binding them and reinforcing them like the central undergirders of a trireme, thus holding together the entire revolving vault. So one Greek trying to explain to another how the universe was held together intuitively felt that it was an enormous, carefully crafted ship. And the inquiring minds of the ancient Greeks were intimately connected with their experience of seafaring. The sail on a ship represents not only the understanding of the behaviour of an elemental force of nature, pure science, but its practical application, applied science. The sail is the earliest human device which harnesses a non-animal energy found in nature to provide energy. And it remained so until the invention of a watermill, almost certainly by a Greek, in the 3rd century BCE. And the energy with which a ship could speed along encouraged the Greeks to imagine it was alive. It was a large animal on which they were riding and from which they had a privileged view of the literal world flashing by and the towns they could see lining the coast. Ancient Greek ships were all given an eye or eyes, a custom stretching way back into the Bronze Age. And in the 6th century, Attic black figure vase paintings often show a warship complete with offensive ramming prow, which resembles a wild boar. And in these, the eye of the ship is the eye of a charging wild animal, crashing through the sea waves as if through forest undergrowth to strike foes with alarming tusks. But on other vast paintings, ships are shown which have two large arresting eyes, one on either side of the prow, just above the waterline. So the sighted ship is alive, observant, vigilant, gathering information from both underwater and the world above as it glides towards the horizon. And Poseidon, the sea deity, was connected with horses, and in this aspect he reminds us that the Greeks, regardless of the degree to which it's fair to claim they were the first philosophers, were neither the first nor the greatest Mediterranean mariners. They had certainly seen the great horse heads decorating the prows of the ships sailed by their eastern and southern maritime rivals, the Canaanites, whom the Greeks called Phoenicians, after the precious crimson-purple dye they procured from seashells. The Phoenicians had long since pioneered the trading routes of the Mediterranean. From the Levant, they had sent out settlements to secure routes by which large cargoes of metals were moved around on their slow, stable, round-hulled merchant ships, and those allowed them to dock in Cyprus, Carthage, Sardinia, and as far west as the Atlantic coast of Spain. They were always seeking new sources of timber with which to maintain the Phoenician fleets. They were intrepid explorers and long-distance sailors. By around 600, according to the classical Greek historian Herodotus, the Phoenicians had even circumnavigated Africa. The mystery of the acceleration of intellectual progress by Greek speakers in the 8th century and onwards may lie at the bottom of the sea in Phoenician shipwrecks yet to be discovered. The Phoenicians were highly inventive and technologically resourceful, alone amongst the ancient Semitic peoples in becoming expert at seafaring. Alongside Baal, the most prominent Phoenician divinity was Melkart, and he's a hunter with special powers over the sea, and the Greeks identified him with Heracles. It may well be, though it cannot yet be proved, that beneath the famous Greek stories about Heracles' labours, especially those set in the West, there lie unknown Phoenician legends. Heracles' far western labours are the quest for the apples of the Hesperides and the cattle of Geryon, respectively. And the remoteness of the second task is underlined by Heracles' means of transport there. He uses some kind of vessel, but it may have travelled through the air rather than on water. It's lent to him by the sun. And when the Greeks started thinking about the ends of their known worlds, their imagination here, as often, fused sailing the sea with aerial flying. The fusion was assisted by the visual similarity they perceived between a ship being propelled along by rows of flashing oars and the rhythmical beating of a bird's feathered wings. And that's a favoured comparison in Greek poetry. Moreover, the sea was connected with the birth of philosophy. If we're to imagine the birth of Greek natural science and philosophy in the Asiatic city of Miletus in the 6th century BCE, we need first to imagine the dramatic change in the physical appearance of the environment. A large chunk of what we now call Western Turkey, actually approximately the whole middle third stretching inward from the modern coast for a minimum of 40 miles, hadn't even yet been created. Miletus in the 6th century BCE was a harbour town, still surrounded on three sides, west and north, by sea water. But the dusty ruins of Miletus now stand near the small modern town, miles from the sea, in any direction at all. The Milesian thinkers who began discussing the unknown causes of the world were watching that world change almost every day. And about 1000 BCE, their harbour began to silt up as the winding, meandering river Meander disgorged itself into the sea far to the northwest, and the particles of rock and soil, the alluvium, sank to the bottom of the estuary. Every year that passed, the alluvium extended the shore towards Miletus, and by the Christian era, when Paul visited Miletus, it was already landlocked. The process must have been half completed when the first philosophers were alive. They will have mourned the inexorable annexation of their beloved sea by the stones of the Asiatic continent. They had ships in their blood and a foundational voyage in their history, since their own town had been settled by colonisers from the Peloponnese. Since, as Greeks, they were insatiably curious, the third of the 10 defining features I identified in the introduction, they inevitably inquired into the reason. And since they were watching fresh water and stones meet salt water and sand, producing new land on a daily basis, they became the first people in recorded history to inquire into the origins of the world exclusively in terms of natural, not supernatural causes. Where earlier Greeks saw the universe as arising from chaos and then from gods who resembled humans, the first scientists of Western Asia, these Ionians, they proposed the primary constituents of the universe were material substances. The very first of them, Thales, born in the 620s, believed the first cosmic principle or element, the one being pushed back by this new land, was water. His argument to support this view is that inanimate things lose water and dry out. And the Roman thinker Seneca attests that Thales said that earthquakes were rockings of the boat. Thales suggested that the world we inhabit rests on top of water, as a ship rests on the sea. And his student Anaximander continued the use of maritime imagery, arguing that the limitless, imperishable phenomenon surrounding the perceptible world also steered it, that same verb, kubanan. Thales was also believed to have written a treatise on navigation by use of the heavens, a skill the Greeks developed as colonists and which helped them to see that there were forces at work, moving objects in the universe, which did not require the arbitrary whims of gods to explain them. Now, ancient tradition made Thales either actually a native Phoenician or the son of Phoenicians living in Miletus. And even if that tradition isn't true, it reflects an ancient intuition that Greek science and philosophy owed much to other ancient Near Eastern cultures. It's not out of the question that a mariner astronomer living in Miletus had Phoenician blood, nor that a Phoenician prior to Thales and prior to Anaximander had suggested that the perceptible world was an enormous seagoing vessel. Anaximander actually drew a map of all the physical world the Milesians knew. He suggested that everything they could perceive, both land and sea, which visibly limited each other, he thought they must be surrounded by something else that was limitless and immeasurable, or apeiron. And the third Milesian thinker of the time, Anaximenes, watched land expand and sea shrink and argued that all the constituents of the world that man could see, fire, wind, cloud, water, earth, stones, are created out of air by processes of condensation or sublimation. The differences between them are to be explained in terms of their relative density. And in Ephesus, another city not far from Miletus, which also became steadily cut off from the sea, a fourth thinker named Heraclitus asserted the principle that the physical universe was constantly changing because of the actions of a cosmic fire. Pantere, he said, everything is in flux. It's not possible for one river to be entered twice by the same man, according to Heraclitus, because the water which constitutes the river is constantly changing, and men never remain in the same state either. The astronomical factor in the traditions surrounding Thales here raises the question of the relationship between the Milesians' ancestral cults and their talent for natural science. Over the last 3 decades, our understanding of early Milesian religion has been transformed by the discovery outside the ancient city walls of an archaic temple of Aphrodite. Many 7th and 6th century terracotta figurines of the goddess have been found, as well as graffiti testifying to dedications which Milesians made to her. And Miletus exported its Ionian cults and calendars to its 50 or more northern and Black Sea colonies and entrepôts, in which Aphrodite was a very important goddess. For example, at Istria and Olbia, where she had the cult title Euploia, fair voyage. At Pantikapion, or Kerch, in Crimea, she was entitled Now Kratis, or ship power. At Cyzicus, her epithet was Pontike, of the high seas. At Miletus, she was also worshipped as Aphrodisia, or foam-born, in line with the Hesiodic story of her generation. But at both Phanagoria and Miletus, she had an additional title, Urania, celestial, in form in which the goddess was conceived of overseeing navigation by the stars. Thales may therefore have found the leap from Olympian theology to water-based cosmic theory far less abrupt than we do. So the Greeks' identity as seafarers underlies not only their history and their geopolitical diaspora, but the literature, myth, art, and even philosophy. The ancient Greeks loved the sea. Thank you.